Well, we do move on to our last session of the day and of the 3-day part of the conference before we get to our company showcase tomorrow. This is perhaps saving, if not the best, at least one of the best conferences or sessions for the last. And it contains a number of folks who've already been here in the conference, and it's going to be led by Jay Skyler, who needs no introduction in the diabetes world. He's touched virtually every corner of therapeutics and diagnostics in diabetes, type 1 and type 2. He has many different accomplishments that we won't need to recapitulate, but just to say, Jay has been a big supporter of the conference. He is certainly bringing people who are interested in diabetes to the conference, and it's great to have you, Jay, to lead the conference. I mean, the session. The session here is to show the great spectrum of different agents that can be put to work, or at least are candidates for improving healthy longevity, ranging from nutritional products to new molecular entities, but in between, repurposing drugs that are already been around a long time, like metformin, or doing combination of drugs that are available and have good safety profiles. So we've got a great panel today. I can't wait to hear it. Over to you,
Thank
Jay.
you, Zan. And I'd like to welcome the panel. Why don't we go around and let each of the panelists give a quick sentence or so of who they are and what their particular interest is in just a sentence or two, and then we can open to discussion. I'm going to go the way that you appear on my screen, which Mike Zemmel, you're first. We've all met you already because you've chaired a couple sessions as the Chief Scientific Officer of Connexum. But in terms of this session, tell us what you're working on too.
Sure. So in a single sentence, Jay?
2 sentences, no more.
So I operate from the perspective that a lot of important biology with therapeutic potential sort of gets overlooked when we seek things, when we seek a 2, 3, 5, or 10-fold effect. There's a lot of important biology in the 30% range, and we can leverage that when by combining often known agents that each on a given metabolic pathway contribute a 20-30% change and in a synergistic manner. So before I was CSO of Connexum, I was CSO of NuCert, which was a spin out of the University of Tennessee. And it was based on just that kind of biology. It was based on taking an amino acid with a presumed anabolic effect, leucine, and instead showing a fairly strong catabolic effect through AMPK and sirtuin-based mechanisms, and essentially combining those. I'm trying to be as brief as I can.
You're over 2 sentences, though.
I can stop. What we have done is we've combined the amino acid leucine with repurposed drugs, low doses of metformin and very low doses of sildenafil. Sildenafil, of course, being a PDE5 inhibitor, but we use doses that are too low to produce that effect and instead produce an activation of eNOS. And you get this virtuous cycle of cross-activation of sirtuins, AMPK, and eNOS that result in some significant effects on weight, on insulin sensitivity, on liver fat, on circulating lipids, and on blood pressure. I'll stop there.
Fair enough. Nir Barzilai is one of the big names in the field, working on metformin and on SGLTs. And you want to tell us what you're trying to do right now? You're on mute, Nir.
Sorry, I'm actually a geroscientist. My career was in biology and neurogerontology, but I'm also an MD, and that's will be my role here. And my role here is really representing the American Federation of Aging Research. And what I'm trying to do is to use metformin just as a tool to convince the FDA that aging is something that can be prevented. Um, and this is what I'm trying to do, because metformin has shown to do all the things that I'm trying to cluster together in a study that's called TAME. And so this is what I'm bringing to the table now.
But also, you've more recently been interested in SGLTs for this purpose.
Yeah, well, I described yesterday, I published a paper with a list of drugs, FDA-approved drugs, that if you give to animals, they live healthier and longer, and that they are FDA approved. And in humans, there's evidence that although they are meant to treat one disease, they have those side effects that they prevent many other diseases and overall mortality. And that's SGLT2 and metformin are the head of the list, but there are several other drugs like that.
You may have said that backwards. My friend George Bacris at the University of Chicago says that although the SGLTs were introduced for diabetes, what they really are drugs that work on the vascular system to prevent heart failure and kidney disease, and that glucose lowering is a side effect that can be relatively trivial.
The same is for metformin. Metformin was used way before it was used for diabetes, for preventive of malaria and flu and arthritis, and then it was kind of hijacked because it lowered glucose in diabetics. But those drugs are gerotherapeutics, which means they have effects much beyond what we're using them for.
Right. Joe, how about introducing yourself?
All right, I'm Joe Bauer. I'm a basic researcher at the University of Pennsylvania. So we do mainly preclinical studies of aging and metabolism in mouse models. And I think most relevant to this conversation, we've done a lot of work on nicotinamide riboside and nicotinamide mononucleotide, which are supplements that boost NAD levels and are proposed to be something that could promote healthy aging in a general sense. So that's held up pretty well in mouse models so far. And the field is kind of on this cusp of trying to show whether or not this really is going to mean something in human subjects. And that attempt at a transition has really highlighted that we don't know, and then even in the mouse models, in many cases, what the underlying mechanisms are, what's the relevant target tissue when you give these supplements, or really how they're being metabolized. And so that's a lot of what I see as the current work for my lab, is filling in a lot of these blanks in the mouse models and really trying to facilitate this transition into humans.
Yeah, it's nice that you can make mice live so long. As long as they don't run around my house, I guess that's okay.
If you were a mice, we had you set, you know?
Stephen Goff was on an earlier session. Zan said goodnight to him because he's in Copenhagen, but now he's back 2 hours later for another session. And we've heard from him before. Stephen is from the UK, but he's currently the Chief Medical Officer at Novo Nordisk. And you've got a few products in this space, right?
Yeah. So thanks, Jay. Yeah, we I think that Novo Nordisk has best been known for 100 years as a diabetes care company. But in recent years, we've also moved very strongly into obesity, and I think probably now would talk about being in cardiometabolism. As you say, I mean, building on insulin, we moved into GLP-1 receptor agonists. But now we're expanding our portfolio in a number of areas, particularly in the cardiovascular space and the diabetes and obesity spaces, looking at inflammation, looking at lipid lowering, and looking at other incretin hormones, if you like, in terms of how we can influence the cardiometabolic state. But I think probably the main molecule that we are best known for, that's been in many clinical trials based on GLP-1 receptor agonists, is semaglutide.
But you also have looked at that in terms of brain and cognitive function and the liver as well, right?
Yeah, so we developed GLP-1 receptor agonists like other companies for diabetes. It became apparent very early on that they were beneficial in terms of weight lowering, so for a potential treatment for people living with obesity. looking into cardiovascular safety, we're able to demonstrate cardiovascular benefit and reduction in major adverse cardiovascular events. But those trials, those large outcome trials, have also shown indications of benefits in chronic kidney disease, metabolic liver disease, and also most recently neurodegeneration. And we're now conducting 2 large trials in patients with cognitive impairment, first in patients with Alzheimer's, and secondly in Alzheimer's and a mixed picture, a mixed vascular dementia. And I think it shows that you start off with one indication, and maybe there are other examples of this, but certainly GLP-1 receptor agonists started out as a diabetes medicine, but now have been shown to have many effects on many systems within the body. And I think, and I would advocate, although not developed for this, now very much contribute to extending the healthy lifespan or healthy longevity, or have the potential to do so.
Which is the goal of this conference to talk about. So
yeah,
it's spot on. We've also heard at an earlier session from Catherine Quick-Uribe, who takes Mars, which we all know for their candy and their pet food, and has converted them to a health benefit company. And with a great study, Cosmos, which had 2 critical papers come out in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition earlier this year, which are in many ways mind-blowing. You want to tell us a little bit about how you got into that, Catherine, and what it's all about?
Sure, that's a great setup. Thank you. So Catherine Quick-Uribe, I work for Mars Incorporated in the segment called Mars Edge, where we focus on better lives through nutrition. I've had the joy through my career in Mars to participate and help lead the longest ongoing human research project in our company. And its focus has been looking at the bioactives in cocoa, a group of flavonoids specifically called flavanols, and their range of health effects. So as you would imagine, in basic research, we started off with acute studies with 10 people or less. We moved over the course of the past decade into studies much longer, larger from a food perspective, from a nutrition perspective, studies of a couple hundred people over the course of several months. But we had the opportunity, actually I was reminiscing about this, about a decade ago, we were approached by a Harvard team to see if we would be interested in partnering on a trial looking at the long-term cardiovascular benefits of these compounds. At the time, Mars was not sure that's the next step we wanted to take. Once again, it's the Cosmos trial, which is the cocoa supplement and multivitamin outcome study. Sort of studies the hardest endpoints you can in nutrition. It's or in health, really, cardiovascular morbidity and mortality. So, but we said yes, and we participated in that trial, which finished in December of 2020. And as Jay indicated, the first few papers published in March of this year. From our perspective, what's really exciting is that we are seeing these bioactive compounds have really profound effects. And a study that was conducted for a period of up to 5 years in generally healthy adults, where the mean age was 72 years old, we see significant reductions in cardiovascular deaths and major cardiovascular events. We have additional studies that will be coming out over the course of probably the next decade as different pieces of the puzzle are continued to be assembled. What's another profound component of the study is the fact that as a longitudinal study, we have there is a significant biospecimen collection. There is also quite a bit of data on lifestyle and nutrition and other things that was collected. So we have the initial results so far, which indicates really profound effects of these bioactives on health. And Mars has a brand currently where we look to commercialize those. But of course, the idea is how do you expand that and get that out to more people, given the benefits? And then expecting much more research to come over the next decade as the different components of the study are analyzed and published. So I think as we talk about sort of aging and sort of healthy aging and disease progression, this is a really exciting population to be looking at because like I said, they started off generally healthy, and being able to look at this group and say, how do they stay healthy? What were biomarkers of health that we might be able to tap into? Also, for those that did develop disease, what was the disease progression? What were the role of nutrition and other lifestyle factors in affecting the course of that disease? So it's definitely, I feel like one of its kind studies in the field of nutrition, and definitely excited to be here with the panel today to discuss some aspects of it.
Great, thank you. Last is Joan Manick. Joan, we've also heard from on a previous session, and she's been trying to find alternative types of mTOR drugs. Rapamycin, we know, is a drug which really profoundly can prolong life in rodents again. And the question is whether it can do so in people, but it has a number of side effects. And so she wants to try to find an easier. I sort of summarized that a little bit for you, Joan.
I don't have to say a word. No. So I'm CEO of Tornado Therapeutics, which has in-licensed a portfolio of new rapalogs and other mTOR inhibitors from Novartis. And as Jay said, we're tasked with the job of figuring out how we can use these in humans to extend healthy lifespan.
Great. And one of the problems with any of these drug or in some cases nutritional therapies in extending the lifespan, and particularly, Catherine talked about doing a study where the endpoint is cardiovascular morbidity and mortality. But many of these people are already on statins, blood pressure lowering medications, and other things which, some of them, if they have diabetes, are on GLP-1s or SGLTs, which we know also decrease these events. And as we get more and more things that are in the background, it becomes harder and harder to dissect out the effects and to design studies that are long enough and large enough to pick up the impact of these things. One of the great problems we had in kidney disease for many years was the impact of ACE inhibitors and angiotensin receptor blockers decreased the progression of kidney disease so much that you needed to do a decade-long study to or have a totally different mechanism in order to really get the beneficial effects. And so, this complicates design. How have you dealt with some of those kinds of things, either Nia or Stephen first?
Well, first, sorry, Stephen, do you want to go first? So first of all, for me, it strictly starts by defining if that's gerotherapeutic. If a drug actually targets all those hallmarks of aging. And it's kind of interesting because metformin and rapamycin, for example, targets all the hallmarks of aging, because what they do is they take an old cell or an old organ or an old body and make it younger, so a lot of things are fixed. Statins are not going to do that. Statins, you can see the hallmarks, you can give it to animals. It's very specific for cholesterol. It has huge effects for humans, but it's not what I consider a gerotherapeutic. And I think the advantage of gerotherapeutics that a lot of them, not all of them, by the way, can be used in combination, so you can build on that. But really the end point of a study is to take a composition of several diseases that we know is aging because it didn't happen during evolution when life expectancy was 20 years old when people die, or 20 to 30. A composite of outcomes that one drug will delay it when the one drug is given in addition to whatever those people are. It's clinical studies. So you're going to have a lot of, and for people over the age of 65 to 79. So you're going to have a lot of drugs, but you add one that is a gerotherapeutic and you're supposed to get additional benefits.
And Stephen, trying to figure out sample sizes and designs with all those other backgrounds. And now, for example, even in just diabetes, where you've shown that GLP-1s are beneficial, if you have something new, do you have to have a background of GLP-1s for equipoise and for ethical reasons?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important question, and it's changing almost every 6 to 12 months, particularly as we start to see trials, as you say, with GLP-1 receptor agonists and SGLT2 inhibitors showing a clinical benefit. I think, and let me just give you an example. In our most recent obesity trial, where we're looking for cardiovascular benefit, we're currently running a trial that will report out next year, our SELECT study, which is 17,500 patients. They're only going to get bigger because, as you say, we're now on lots of background therapies. I think what I would argue is that there is still a residual risk, which is why we're going after that residual risk. There are still people, unfortunately, having cardiovascular events. But it is getting harder, and the sample sizes are getting bigger. So we are looking at ways in which, how can we still demonstrate a cardiovascular benefit? And I think if you've got a new GLP-1 receptor agonist or a similar drug, and you've got to go up against one, even one of your own, in a comparator group, can you really demonstrate superiority? And would the regulators accept that actually non-inferiority to something that shows a cardiovascular benefit also is actually bestowing a cardiovascular benefit? So that's one of the things that certainly we and others are looking at. And the other is now with increasing size of databases, with artificial intelligence, the way we can model data these days. I think the big question now is, can we do large clinical trials without actually having to run a placebo arm? And can we use placebo data from other trials? So we are looking all the time at how we can do trials differently, because if we just continued with the trials that you and I did over the last 5 to 10 years, we could be looking at 50, 60, 70, 80,000 patients in a trial, which is clearly...
No. I think this is such an important point, okay? And let me again talk about the TAME trial. You need much less people, not more people, because if you cluster, look, we're agnostic, right? Aging drives the disease. So we're agnostic what disease you're going to have, what disease you're bringing, and what disease you're going to get. Whatever disease it is, whether it is cardiovascular or cancer or cognitive decline or mortality, you're going to get a point, because for us, it's about targeting aging. So once you're talking with people between the ages 65 and 79, they're not going to have just one outcome like you're saying, okay? They're going to have several outcomes. And when you have several outcomes, you need less people. So we're doing, and it's not significant in any one. You don't have to have significant in any one, only in the cluster. So TAME is 3,000 people with very likely, based on previous studies, very likely to get this effect probably in a little bit over 4 years, because any outcome is welcomed. And I think that's the breakthrough when we're talking about aging and when we're going to take pharmaceuticals. If you really think you're going to have lots of effects, cluster them together and you'll need less people, because old people get a lot of those things. If I had to do only cardiovascular disease, I would have to have 12,000 people, but I don't, because I don't need to be sick. In fact, I cannot be significant in cardiovascular. Imagine I get metformin and in 2 years there's a cardiovascular significance. We'll kind of have to stop the study and not get the cluster, the aging part that we want.
Well, Jay, I'd just like to make a distinction between starting with people who have disease, or at least are close to having them, and those who are more like the population that Catherine and the Cosmos trial involved in that study. The real aspiration is that we would start with people who are healthy, and we would have a product that is safe enough to be used in that population. And obviously, the problem there is not people being so much on statins and other agents that would tend to make it harder to see an effect, but it is that there is an absolutely smaller event rate that makes for very large trials. So obviously, the Cosmos trial was very large, and it's the kind of study that we really need in people who are closer to healthy than people who already have diabetes. Now, you have to run or you have to crawl before you walk. And obviously we can make progress in developing treatments for diabetes, but we've been the victim of we are the victim of our success, as has been pointed out, that we will have increasingly harder times in testing new products on background therapies that work. So it's really a kind of dichotomy in terms of population that we aspire to treat.
Yeah, but when you have a healthier population, there's going to be less events.
That's right.
So you either need a much larger population or a longer study.
That's right.
And you know, who's going to pay for those kinds of studies becomes the question that's in there. The cardiovascular outcomes studies have already increased the cost of developing drugs for diabetes by perhaps $300 million per drug, maybe more. And you know, one of the things that Stephen was saying, which I think is important, is you have to perhaps go against another drug, and they might go against even one of their own in the same class, but where the effect in the case of the semaglutide study that he was talking about is that even if you have the same amount of cardiovascular outcomes, you still have the effect on weight that's better. And you've already shown previously that the cardiovascular benefit is seen against placebo with the other drugs. So now you can extend that and say, okay, it's equivalent with this drug. It's non-inferior.
But again, that is the proposition for people that already have diabetes. Now, the question for Stephen might be, would Novo invest in a prediabetes trial to show that they could ultimately prevent CV events? Now, obviously, it would need to be an enriched population, but that is one potential target that would be a little closer towards the healthier population that we ultimately would like to test.
And I would argue we've already done that and gone even further, because we've gone for an obese population.
For obesity, that's right. And so in that population, if you show cardiovascular benefit, then certainly you're entitled to that indication. The question would be, can you keep pushing further towards normal people or people that don't have risk factors?
And to your point on sort of pre-diabetes, clearly in the cohort of 17,500 patients with obesity, where there would traditionally be a high conversion rate over a number of years. That's data we're clearly collecting, and we will be able to look into in terms of how do we compare, to our comparator. I mean, what just to go back to the question around clustering, and of course we've looked at that, and we've looked at that for years, maybe not in terms of healthy lifespan and healthy longevity, but when you look at cardiovascular events, we already cluster into MACE. And when you move into primary prevention, you're looking at expanded MACE. And if you look at another trial we're doing at the moment, where we're looking at renal outcomes, we have multiple kidney endpoints that we're looking at. But to the point of spreading it beyond one disease area, if you like, whether we're talking about healthy longevity or whatever, when we talked to the regulators about our renal outcome trial, and we said, well, a lot of these patients will also die from cardiovascular disease, so can we include that in a composite endpoint? The answer was yes, but there has to be a high proportion of renal events, understandably, because we were looking for a renal benefit. So I'm not sure how far the regulators are ready to look at multiple diseases in a traditional RCT. And I know that, I've been at this conference 2 or 3 over the last few years, and I remember listening to Janet Woodstock actually when we were face to face, talking about how we could even use pragmatic trial design to look at multiple endpoints. But again, they'd have to be pre-specified. It would still have to be a randomized trial. But I think there is an opportunity to move the regulators, but I also think it's fair to say they're looking to us to come up with the methodology. And any step they do take tends to be relatively small at any one time, rather than large, big steps forward. But there's certainly opportunities to look at trials differently, and we have to, because it is becoming harder.
So, Zan, you've been a regulator. How do you think regulators will respond to these kinds of questions?
Well, as Stephen said, we heard from Janet Woodcock that they would consider such a composite. But she added there would need to be some kind of contribution from each component within that composite to give them comfort for approving a so-called health span indication. And I don't mean to say exactly how that would read, but the point is, I think the regulators in principle are open to the kind of composite that NEAR is using in the TANE trial, but it will not be enough just to show that the composite changes in a statistically significant manner. It will also require at least strong trends of the components.
Right.
And
Or at least majority of the
and then there is the question of what would be considered clinically meaningful in terms of this composite. What kind of effect size would be considered clinically meaningful? And that's a little harder with a number around a composite.
I'm just listening to Stephen wondering, you already have, let's say your Alzheimer's disease trial works and your kidney trial works. You have the same dose of the same drug now having in a, I don't know whether it's an obese or a diabetic or an obese diabetic population, but preventing cardiovascular events, Alzheimer's, kidney disease progression. Couldn't you now, you've now got statistical significance, get that combined endpoint?
Well, this is something that we're looking at. What we actually do with it then is another question. Whether you would then try and submit something like that to the regulators to get an indication or an approval, I'm not sure. But I mean, to me, I think what's important is that if you have multiple indications, there are multiple reasons why you should use that medicine in a variety of populations, and those people will then ultimately benefit in more than one way. So it's not that I'm not saying the holy grail is to say, well, here we have an indication for healthy lifespan, but we may say if you're a patient with diabetes and you get this, we know we will have benefits A, B, C, D, E. If you're a patient who is overweight, you get A, B, C, D. If you are, so in other words, you can still target large parts of the population who have a primary disease, if you like, or an indication for the reason they're seeing that physician or healthcare professional, and then they get all these added benefits. So I think for us, whether it's necessary or whether we would ever be inclined to do that sort of analysis, I think we would do, because I think it's interesting from a health economic point of view. You know, I could see getting to the point where you say, well, look, if you were to go into a GLP-1 receptor agonist, how many hospital visits could you avoid? How many visits to the GP, your primary care physician, could you avoid? So I think that there could be a health economic argument for doing that sort of analysis. But from a medical point of view, I'm not sure we need to.
Right. I'd be happy to take a drug that has benefits in all those areas if I need it for only one of them. Why not?
Yeah.
Just one other thought, taking off from NEAR. Could you take your backup compounds and do you already kind of know if it's a GLP-1 receptor agonist, it's probably going to have benefits, cardiovascular, renal, brain, weight. Do a TAME-like trial to decrease your sample size to say, we're going to show benefits in one or more of these four. So you have an increased event rate.
So, I mean, I think we would have to have the discussion with the regulators before for us, virtually nearly every study we do, as we go through a clinical development program, we have a discussion with the regulators to say, this is what we're proposing. What do you think? How would you view the outcome? Because obviously, a lot of the trials that we do, not all of them, but a lot of the trials that we do are to seek an indication so that we can actually get them to more patients so that more patients can benefit from that molecule or whatever the agent is. So I'm not saying we wouldn't do that, but we would only do that if we were looking for an indication of multiple conditions as part of a healthy lifespan. I think we would want to know we got the go ahead from the regulator in advance before we said, here's the study, we've done it, what do you think?
And Steve, I think you should think about it. Look, you have to frame it differently to the regulators, right? You have to come and say, what we found is that this is a gerotherapeutic, right? This is actually delayed aging because all the major age-related diseases, one drug is doing. It's not because the drug is designed to 6 different things. It's because it's doing something in the biology of aging. And that's what we've done with the TAME. We went to the FDA. They got in all the people who are involved in all the major departments had, and we explained to them what we have, and they were very open to the prospect that, yeah, maybe aging itself can be delayed, and therefore all those diseases will be delayed. And I think if you frame it like that, and we'll be happy, I'm sure we all here will be happy to come with you and kind of build on the TAME. And maybe it's going to be a breakthrough even before TAME happens. But you have to frame it differently and get to discuss with other people what you can achieve with this drug.
It's interesting because what we're talking about here is metformin on the one hand and GLP-1s on the other, and the safety database for both of those drugs is absolutely enormous. And it's so huge that safety becomes a non-issue. And since the regulatory agencies are often looking at risk benefit, you can get rid of the risk part of it and focus on the benefit. And I think that's a clear advantage over starting with something new. Like, Joan wants to start with a rapamycin analog or something that's on mTOR, and there's no database yet for safety. So she's got a much harder path in dealing with the regulators for these issues, even though the mice may show that, it's an absolutely great pathway for extending life. Joan, what do you think?
Well, I'd say the nice thing about the rapalogs is it's a class of drugs, and many of them have already been approved. So we know the safety of high doses of these drugs. The doses that we need for aging are much smaller. So I think we have a little bit of a step up. We're nowhere near the metformin because we are a new clinical entity, the rapamycin derivatives, but there's a little bit of a step up. But you're right, there's a lot of drugs targeting aging pathways that are completely new, that are way behind.
And what about Joe? You're dealing with natural substances, basically. And what kind of pathway would you have to face to bring those to the clinical arena? And have you developed a partner yet to do that?
Yeah, I would say this whole discussion kind of highlights some of the difficulties you have with these natural substances. I think the FDA recently counted 29,000 supplements on the market. So when you talk about the difficulty of taking one drug with well-characterized pharmacokinetics and a target to measure and the backing of a large company, and try to imagine doing that 29,000 times, it's just not feasible. And I think as a community, we have to kind of accept that for a lot of these ideas are never going to be tested, right? In our lifetimes, we're never going to know if milk thistle extends your lifespan. Like, there's no path to actually getting hard data on these questions. And so I think we really have to rethink, what sort of intermediate evidence we can get as at least a hypothesis generating step in order to decide how to move forward with it, so we don't just abandon essentially everything that's in the sort of the nutraceutical realm as far as gathering scientific evidence. And so one thing I've been very frustrated to not see happen and would love to see is a little bit more tracking of people who are taking these substances. So for instance, with the NAD precursors, we know that there's hundreds of thousands of people who've been taking them for years right now. And if you actually could get the histories of all those people, you would actually have pretty hard statistics on whether or not it affects mortality or heart disease or cancer. And that's really, I feel like, a missed opportunity that is just not getting picked up for all of these sorts of supplements, as well as lifestyle changes, things like the ketones, like we heard about in the previous session. There's enough people on ketogenic diet to have the same sorts of answers. And I think there really is a reality there that it's just not possible today to do a full clinical trial, and especially in a prevention mode on any of these things.
And the reason is because there is no incentive for a company to do it. There's no intellectual property. There'd be no way of developing a product unless you had some kind of special formulation that would allow you to have some kind of commercial value. And in a way, this is a problem that Mars Edge faces, because there's really no incentive, as things stand now, for Catherine to do the Cosmos trial. And it might be interesting to have Catherine talk about the limitations of what they can even say about the results of the largest trial that's ever been done of this kind in the nutritional arena. It's the largest trial you've never heard of. And so
21,000 people.
Yeah, and these are largely healthy people. It's just an amazing accomplishment, but it is a unicorn, because there was really no real incentive for Mars to do this that would pay back the investment.
Yeah, so I as a privately held company who's viewed science from a long-term perspective, that was the primary motivation. But when we looked at this, I think part of the challenge we've had, and Joe touches upon this a little bit, is that you can do the studies, and typically in nutrition, they are going to be smaller, shorter in duration, use various surrogate endpoints. And you have the challenge that the question is always, yes, but how does it really affect the outcomes? And so on one way, you have evidence, but you're sort of damned if you do or damned if you don't, because you have that evidence, but then they always say there is often pressure. Yes, but what are the long term? How does that play out? And I think, part of our motivation for doing the trial was to actually address that question. And for us, it was around specifically the bioactives in cocoa, but the reality is these similar bioactives exist in a variety of foods. And really it was about, our motivations were around both advancing understanding about the flavonols specific to cocoa, but flavonols generally, and hoping to begin to push forward a path for recognition of the other components in foods and the role that they can play in health and disease, and disease prevention, as well as disease management. I use those last two terms, but I'm actually legally not allowed to in the food and nutrition, in the food and supplement space. But here we are. Just think of the irony in this, that we're the largest trial in history on a bioactive. The study demonstrates, when you look both from if you take intention to treat and you look at the secondary endpoints, you do see a significant reduction in cardiovascular deaths. If you consider those who were compliant with the intervention, self-reporting that they took it, you see the primary as a significant reduction of 15% in major cardiovascular, in the composite cardiovascular events. You see a 39% reduction in cardiovascular deaths, and then a 24% reduction in MACE. I can say that on this call and this group. I can't present that in any association with the product itself or in association with a branded website, because the FDA would say those are all disease claims. And foods and supplements cannot make those type of claims. And so you could argue, well, free speech allows me to do that. The FDA hasn't quite always allowed that either. So it has been a challenge, because here you are in a situation where trying to get the word out, but actually as a business, it's actually very difficult for us to get the word out. Good news is people like myself, scientists and others within the team can help advance that. But from a business perspective, it's a tightrope of what we can say, what we can do. And yet the numbers I'm talking about are at a scale in a generally healthy population. We should be able to get the word out, because the other component of this is that the intervention over this period of time was incredibly safe and well tolerated. So you have an intervention which demonstrates both from, you've got the totality of evidence that led up to it from the shorter term trials and a variety of people, younger and different stages of health and disease. Then you've got the trial itself. And so you've got evidence, strong and consistent evidence of a benefit. And you're limited and it's good record of safety and tolerability, and yet the difficulty is we can't really talk about it.
Why can't you formulate it as a drug and apply to the drug section of the FDA for a cocoa flavonoid containing drug?
So I think there are a couple of things. So I guess technically somebody could. That wouldn't necessarily be in our DNA to do that. I mean, that's not our skill and competency. From an IP and protection perspective, natural products, you can't really protect them. So you can get them from a process of manufacture, but it's really difficult to sort of protect this space. And then quite honestly, and even if it sort of touched upon in the previous panel, foods and supplements are available. I mean, when you think of a dietary approach, it seems strange to me that the only way to see the benefits come to reality is by taking a drug approach, as opposed to saying, why isn't there a channel and opportunity in the food and nutrition space?
Right. Yeah.
So it's not that it almost feels like, because I can't get here, I have to go that way. Why do they have to be mutually exclusive? Why can't there be a path for the food and nutrition space that allows us to legally communicate and express the value and benefits of our products to consumers without exclusively having to go down the drug realm?
Why couldn't Mars sell it as a supplement?
We do sell it as a supplement, but the supplement is still bound. It's under the food regulations. It's bound by the same
one
rules.
I would take. Oh, you had to do it.
Oh, I've got some I can give you.
Right. Just say,
Yeah, so we
here's
do
a
actually
paper.
commercialize. We do
Okay.
actually commercialize the same ingredient that was used in the Cosmos trial as a dietary supplement, but I still can't talk about the benefits directly of the trial. I have to dance around words that are allowed lawfully, but I can't actually talk about a 27% reduction in cardiovascular deaths or 39% reduction amongst those who consumed the intervention. So it's supplements don't, that despite the belief that they are not regulated, they're not regulated like drugs, but they're not unregulated, and they're sit more under the food regulations than they do under the drug regulations.
So maybe the
They're
regulation,
intended to supplement the diet, not necessarily to be a drug in themselves.
maybe the regulations need to be changed so that if you have done a 21,000 patient study that shows benefit, you can use that to, you've demonstrated the safety and efficacy. You ought to be able to use that to support the supplement better than what people are doing under O'Shea. I mean, the Shea has been a disaster in my view.
Well, Jay, that actually is something that the Catalyst Institute is actively promoting as a part of the regulatory reform that would come about by targeting healthy longevity and having a national policy and regulatory pathways. The idea is not to get rid of dietary supplements, though some would say that would maybe be worth regulating a little tighter. But it's to have an additional pathway that would incentivize companies like Mars to actually put their product on the market with a claim and thereby have exclusivity for a long enough period of time to give a return on the investment that they've made to get those data. And this is the same proposition for Joe, or at least he's sort of the analog of a dietary supplement company that has an NAD product that they would like to do a long trial on, but they just right now don't have the incentive to do it.
Well, Joe mentioned that we need some sort of population data on it. The NIH has the All of Us study enrolling 1 million people. I don't know whether they're collecting information within that on, whether people are using various supplements and other things or not, but it's quite possible they are. I haven't really looked at the details of the protocol because they're collecting lots and lots of things. Perhaps that's a way to get to some of the information that Joe was talking about. Do you know the answer to that, any of you?
I just want to say that there is this, we formed this Healthy Longevity Medicine Society to train doctors in longevity medicine. There's no drug out there, but there's plenty of things to do and measure. And one of the things we want to promote is something that was invented, I don't know by who, but popularized by a statistical guy by the name of Nick Shork, and it's called the N+1 study, that you can actually have a patient, one patient, but to do something in one patient like that in every clinic and collect data that will be meaningful. And it's kind of tracking power. And I think this is what we want to help implement, this N+1, for exactly like the NAD story, right? Things like that. People who are taking it, but if you can collect data before and after, you can actually make sense of that.
The problem is FDA.
Not FDA, but get data.
Yeah, but the problem is that would strengthen a hypothesis if you found with those data that there was an association with a benefit. But FDA would say, well, now it's time to use a randomized trial to prove it.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we're back at square one.
Right.
But Michael, it sounds like you have tried to get around the issue of formulation of this by putting together the low dose sildenafil with the other things in a single formulation, so that you do have an identifiable product that can be controlled with intellectual property. And that's a novel kind of way of approaching this, isn't it?
So we have done that, Jay. And just to back up a step, we tried doing it with a strictly nutritional approach as well. And we got some great clinical data before we hit on metformin, sildenafil, and leucine. We got some great clinical data using leucine and a couple of botanicals that were carefully selected and screened. And we had very solid clinical data. And then we sort of looked and said, what do we do with this? Who cares? Exactly what Catherine indicated. There was nothing we could say about it. And we made a very quick pivot to land where we landed. And yes, we have solid intellectual property. It's been vetted multiple times. You have to address the combination drug rule, and you've got to do singlets, doublets, and triplets. And there are some clever ways around that, or not around it, but to make it a little more streamlined. Some nice experimental approaches that can be done. I'd like to just back up a minute and go back to this real world evidence issue. It's been, as Joe suggested, and as you were suggesting a moment ago, Jay, the problem, at least I believe the problem in doing that, if you could put your hands on the data, is you have a variety of different supplements just within the NAD supplement space. You have much less other dietary supplements. You have a variety of different supplements at a variety of different doses, at a variety of different qualities that may or may not contain what they say they contain on the label, may or may not have contained what they thought they contained at the time of packaging because of poor quality control in some cases. So at the end of the day, if you come up with a negative result, is it a negative result?
I think in any case, it's a hypothesis generating result. But I think if we are going to narrow the field of all these ideas that are out there to say which ones are worthy of the TAME trial, of becoming the next candidate, I think we need some sort of intermediate stage of data gathering.
And speaking of real world evidence, I think it's important to emphasize that is not just uncontrolled data, that you can do large pragmatic trials in the real world setting. Those data are interpretable, just as for any other randomized trial. There may be greater variability, but you can overcome that with the numbers that presumably can come because the per subject cost is reduced by reducing all the monitoring and the conventional approaches that are needed for drug trials.
Well, the Duke Clinical Research Institute collaborated with the Oxford Clinical Trials Unit to do large pragmatic studies. And if recollection serves me correctly, the director of the Duke Clinical Research Unit at that time is now the FDA commissioner. So maybe he's more inclined to think about the use of those kinds of pragmatic trials and that kind of evidence.
Well, he's a colleague of yours, and you know well that he's very sympathetic to that concept.
That's why I brought it up. But so some of what needs to be done here, it seems to me, is what the Catalyst Institute is doing, trying to get some of the rules changed so that we can get on the market various things that will promote a healthy longevity, whether they be drugs or nutraceuticals or whatever.
Well, and yeah, along those lines, I just to echo some of what's been said about changing the rules, just by virtue of my position, for whatever reason, I've ended up, talking to a lot of sort of small fly-by-night nutraceutical companies who often, found their company with the intention of doing scientific research on their product and being the one that's backed by science, and almost always they have these exact thoughts of either they're going to combine two things, without caring whether or not there's any reason to combine them, just to generate something proprietary, but will cloud the data a little bit on the interpretation of the individual things. Or they just decide at the end of the day, they finally have a meeting and just say, it's not worth it because everybody benefits equally from our research. There's nothing proprietary about this, and we're going to make an infomercial. And so I think some changes in the rules here really, really could have a very real world effect on how some of these companies do business.
Absolutely.
And I would say this came up a little bit on a previous call as well, or a previous panel, and that is, I think particularly for some of the nutraceuticals or the nutritional components from some of these supplements, a couple of things. I think, as Michael raised, I think we need, as industry, as a group, the idea of better analytical tools for characterization of these components. I mean, it's great to call something ginkgo biloba or milk thistle or whatever it is, but to really make sure that there is at least some consistent chemical characterization, and I think that's critical. So often the investment in the analytical tools is not there as it should be. So I think that's important. I think the other is taking advantage of whether it's in one trial or whether it's taking advantage of large population bases for which there is information gathered on diet, both in terms of self-reported information, but more importantly, blood samples and other things that can be used for analysis of biomarkers. So I would always have a plea, particularly in the area of food and nutrition and supplements. What are relevant biomarkers of intake? So of course that is tied to the analytical, because if I know some of the bioactive constituents that I'm talking about in a plant or extract, and then what is their ADME as it relates to what could end up in the circulation or in other biological samples, so that you can use data sets that are already available and probe them better for information as it relates to what's the relationship between these components. And I think, we're going to get better answers when we also get better data, and that better data is going to come by investments in other areas to help bolster, I think, particularly the area of the nutraceutical and nutrition space, because that's really been lacking I would say, for quite a long time now.
And again, you need incentives to do that. That's the big problem.
Are there some things that we need to be concerned about? For example, if we make the entire population live longer, healthier, will we break the bank in Social Security and Medicare so that we can't afford to maintain an elderly population in terms of Social Security and Medicare?
So I want to point out to a large literature that we've been accumulating and funding through AFAR and others, that's called the longevity dividend. For example, I have centenarians that not only live longer, they live healthier. They live 30 years health. They get diseases 30 years healthier. And not only that, they have a contraction of morbidity. They're sick very little time at the end of their life. We have 30% of centenarians that don't have any disease and they just don't wake up in the morning. The CDC have analyzed this data and showed that the medical cost in the last 2 years of life of somebody who dies over the age of 100 is third of those who die in 70. And that came up to a calculation of a health span and contraction of morbidity that was trillions of dollars until 2 years ago came a guy, Scott Andrew or Andrew Scott from London School of Economy. And he said, guys, you're totally off because it's not only that this guy is not in the hospital. What is he doing? He's traveling, he's shopping, he's getting things for his grandkids. There's an economical value for that. And when he calculates the economical value, this is, by the way, a Nature Aging paper, it's like $380 trillion within 10 years. He continues and say 10% of that will solve, $36 trillion will solve global warming to a large extent. In other words, we cannot afford not to do that. By the way, a curiosity, he took the data on metformin that we proposed for the TAME trial, you know, the preliminary data, the studies that showed that metformin prevents cardiovascular disease and cancer and diabetes. And he basically calculates that if we do the TAME trial with 3,000 people, remember only 1,500 of them are on metformin, it's placebo control, that we're going to save to the economy from economical value $150 million when the study cost $50 million. So I think we have totally underestimated how improvement in health span is going to affect health span and economy. And by the way, the lobbyists, we're working with lobbyists. By the way, interesting, the lobbyists that are helping us is Newt Gingrich on the right and Stephen Israel, who's a Democrat, on the left, because they think longevity is a great thing to work across the aisle. And they really are coming up with a lot of the economy to push healthy, targeting healthy longevity. Did I use it right, Zen?
That's right. Thank you.
To really start and getting from the perspective of the you know the House and Senate to get, and there's already language about that in the last session. So I think we need to, and we're making progress here, but the economy is absolutely important.
So Thomas, you want to open your microphone because you raised an interesting point in the chat about this, about how we may need to adjust the retirement age if we're going to not bankrupt Social Security and all.
Yes, I mean, that was studied by the National Academy of Medicine global roadmap for healthy longevity. An international commission looked at the question of what kinds of adjustments to society and the economy are necessary to accommodate healthy longevity. So we have some of the top thinkers in the field looking at exactly those things. And I echo Nir's point that the economists, as far as they've been looking at the issue, net ahead trillions of dollars, notwithstanding things like entitlement payments, provided we make certain adjustments. I mean, the retirement age may have to go up and so forth, but it's win-win-win.
Great.
It's also important to say that these ideas are premised on making people that have short lives be as healthy as people that have long lives, or something like calorie restriction, where at least in rodents it's making them live longer because they're much healthier. And the majority of evidence suggests that's where we're going with a lot of these treatments are hoping to get. I mean, there's an alternative model where you say keep people alive with drugs that just prolong their disease, keep them from dying, from tipping over the edge, or potentially with devices like dialysis machines and things where you may actually increase the cost of living longer if you're not able to also improve health. But that's also why I think it's so important that the way these drugs are being tested and evaluated is based on their ability to delay disease. And so I think we're inherently choosing the drugs that are and interventions that are likely to do exactly what Nir says. Right?
Joe, if I can just say, it's a certain amount of self-correction going on there, because if this space is not able to come up with healthy longevity drugs, then you're just playing the current game of whack-a-mole. If we're
Right.
able to cure somebody of cancer, they're going to die of
Feeling like
Alzheimer's.
sunshine, like springtime, like something's
It was the sunshine
Thank you.
itself.
Yes, thank you for that fanfare, whoever
The
that was.
Singapore.
A ray of light from the heavens or something based on my comments.
I am curious, as someone approaching retirement age, and sounds like such a fun time of life, is this really for sure that you have to delay retirement if you extend healthy longevity?
Depend on your salary now, John.
It's not that high.
But you still will be productive, but in other ways.
Right.
You'll be taking care of your grandkids.
Right.
Sure. Yeah, I'm not so worried about that. Jay, I think on balance, we're likely to have some kind of economic benefit. It may not be as big as we would hope, but it's certainly not a worry to deter us from trying.
No, I think
I'd say
healthy longevity is really a great idea. I'm not criticizing that. I'm just saying, there may be economic issues that we're going to need to contend with, particularly as we get more and more people in the older population and not enough young people doing the things that generate funds for Social Security and the like.
But there's another aspect of that. And think of China, okay? We are not in as bad a place as many other places in the world. But China had one kid per two parents for decades, right? So their aging population is just exceeding. And, the kids are not living next to them or living in another country. They have a real problem. So you also have to you have to increase the resiliency of the parents, okay? Because otherwise, if you just stay with a lot of diseases, you cannot take care of them. So I think the idea that you maximize the health of the elderly is very important on its own.
It is, and we're obviously getting older on average globally, so we've got to somehow compensate for improving function and economic contributions.
So, Michael, what did happen with your combination of leucine and metformin and sildenafil? Have you done full-scale trials on that, or where does that stand?
Yeah, so we've run a couple of phase 2 clinical trials, one small-ish of about 70, and the other much larger of about 270 or 260, I've forgotten now. And these are randomized clinical trials that produce the effects that I've already described on weight, actually on multiple, what we would call metabesic dimensions, to honor the name of this conference. And none of those effects would be described as class-leading effects. So it's not going to be the best obesity drug. It's not going to be the best antihypertensive drug, but it is a low-cost drug because our cost of producing it is very low. We're repurposing off-patent drugs in combination. It's going to be a low-cost drug whose side effect profile, so AEs actually don't separate from placebo in either of those trials. So a well-tolerated, low-cost drug that I think could be, in the right hands, widely disseminated. Interestingly enough, the anti-obesity effects, the anti-hypertensive effects, and in fact, the effects on insulin sensitivity are all best in individuals who are insulin resistant. it works well, insulin resistant or not, but normally you tend to see worse effects in that population. And we've got that flipped. We've got nice, strong effects. However, this is something where the company is seeking to partner, because the next step is simply one that is out of reach for a small company, phase 3.
But
And there
can I make a
again-
comment?
Go ahead, Nir.
Because you said the low cost. I think, look, the people who need most help in the United States are the poor people, who in every city live 20 years shorter than the rich people. And I think, and by the way, that's part of the attraction of metformin, which is the cheapest drug in the formulary.
Sure.
But I think the first who needs help are those people, and their health has to be improved and their disease has to be prevented, because they die sooner. So I think there's a lot of, I take it really seriously, the low cost here.
Yeah, no, I agree with you there. As I say, we simply need a partner to help us take us the rest of the way.
Who will be that partner? It's not going to be Novo, because they don't get into pills generally. It's not even going to be Lilly or any other big pharma company, because they just don't take on repurposed products. It just doesn't fit in their portfolio. And yet, as Michael has described, there's great value in what this combination product delivers. It just falls short of the kind of target product profile that is needed to attract a large pharma partner. And it could maybe Gates Foundation could get behind it and make it available. But that's the real challenge, the lack of incentives for developing a product that really could make a difference in an underserved population in particular.
Well, and it in fact did have some interesting effects in underserved populations. For example, the antihypertensive effect of the combination in the African American population was actually quite striking. And this is a population that suffers a disproportionate both frequency and intensity of hypertension, and it's most difficult to treat in this population. But again, we'll have to find.
And by the way,
that
the
right
effect size.
What?
Yeah, I was just going to say the effect size on blood pressure is in the range of what could be used to approve the product for hypertension.
It's in excess of that range, yes.
Yeah, but the problem is what companies are developing antihypertensives today. It's just, again, conditions do not favor developing this particularly attractive product from a standpoint of public health, but not from a commercial standpoint.
Yeah, and the
I
cost
am sadly all too aware, yes.
the cost of you said the cost of goods would be low, but the cost of marketing and everything else could actually raise the price substantially that you need to charge to break even.
Well, of course, marketing is marketing, but we're talking about a drug combination that, with the cost of goods, the cost of tableting, the cost of putting it in the bottle, labeling it and getting it out to people, those are known costs, and those are very low. The marketing cost, I am gratefully ignorant of marketing.
I wouldn't say that big pharma would necessarily not be interested in something like that. It depends whether, if you had something with sort of multiple modest effects, might not be as strong as GLP-1 receptor agonist, but if you had something with a multiple modest effect that was relatively safe, or was safe, had a very low side effect profile, it may be that someone would be interested in it from an over-the-counter point of view, because we have to accept that there are different horses for courses. If we would take the obese population, people living with obesity, that it's not one homogeneous population. There's some people with morbid obesity who need really powerful compounds. There are some people who need the more more weight loss aspect to the medicine. And I think there's certainly an opportunity, even for big pharma, to consider developing something like that as an over-the-counter product.
Very interesting.
Interesting thought, Stephen. But typically, you need to go through the new drug approval route before you go to the OTC route.
It would still have to. It would have to be. It would have to go through a normal clinical development program, but it doesn't mean that it wouldn't be attractive as in that sort of marketplace, particularly if it was inexpensive to make, and therefore you could actually pitch it at a low price or a competitive price.
So let me ask Joan, Michael has talked about what he's done in terms of trials. With your rapalogs, what trials have been done so far, and where does it stand in terms of potential development?
Sure. So we started the program at Novartis treating healthy older adults with very low doses of rapalogs that we predicted would be safe. And one of the things we found was they upregulate antiviral immunity, and everybody who was getting the rapalogs were reporting fewer respiratory tract infections as adverse events. And most respiratory tract infections are caused by viruses even before COVID-19. So we moved it forward to enhance antiviral immunity and decrease the incidence of viral respiratory tract infections. And we hit a phase 2B endpoint, which was lab confirmed infections with a nasopharyngeal swab as part of that endpoint, which the FDA requested. But then for the phase 3, they said, in the real world, this was 2018 before COVID, no one gets nasopharyngeal swabs when they get a respiratory tract infection. So you can't have that as part of your endpoint. You just have to have you have to decrease the incidence of respiratory symptoms. And that's a really tough endpoint because respiratory symptoms are so nonspecific, and we didn't hit it. But I think we are getting smarter and smarter about what is the right endpoint now. And the FDA, of course, understands nasopharyngeal swabs are commonplace. So I think we have a path forward that's exciting with these new mTOR inhibitors.
Yeah.
And
Well,
the
it's
FDA
exciting for reducing respiratory infections, but what about extending longevity?
So we had this big meeting with the FDA that Janet Woodcock led, and it had every FDA division head in that room. They were excited about targeting aging and extending healthy longevity. And again, I talked about this the last session. Their recommendation was start with improving immune function and decreasing respiratory tract infections. Then take your next indication, sort of similar to what Stephen's doing with the GLP-1 receptor agonist. Do cardio or musculoskeletal, figure out the dose for each of those indications. And then if there's one dose where you hit multiple indications, they were amenable to giving us this extends healthy lifespan, or this is an anti-aging drug indication.
I just want to underline the fact that the FDA asked here to use an instrument that they haven't used in people 70 years old who are typically complaining. And it's not like a young person who you treat psoriasis and he tells you, yeah, I feel better. And I think that's another thing. The FDA wants their own stuff, and it's complicated sometimes. The geriatrician are saying to their patients, if you wake up in the morning and you have no pain, you're dead. Because what is it to ask them if they're feeling well? It's not a validated instrument in the elderly. You don't do that.
Well, in fairness to the FDA too, they wanted the instrument validated. I think you're exactly right, though. Older people have lots of respiratory symptoms when they know they're not sick, or don't have a respiratory tract infection. So it's complicated.
It also reminds us that immune resilience is a very important property. We discovered that during the pandemic. We think of cardiovascular risk and neurodegenerative risk, but risk of serious acute infection is equally a threat. And so we should be working on products that can improve immune resilience.
Right. And I don't know if you guys were at the Bill Hazeltine sessions, but you had all these high-level government people talking about, oh, there is definitely going to be another pandemic. It was just like, I don't know when it's happening, but it was scary to hear them.
But Joan, you and I were having a little sidebar about what it would take to demonstrate to the FDA immune resistance. And your flip answer was just get sick less often. I mean, just how practical is that kind of clinical investigation to generate the data that would suffice for FDA standards?
It isn't hard. So pre-COVID, people 65 and older have 1.5 respiratory tract infections a year. It is an event rate that is very high. And the FDA is fine if you can show you decrease the incidence of those events, you can, or severity, oftentimes it's the severity, you will get it, approvable endpoint. And we have a path forward for flu drugs with that endpoint. What they weren't used to is a drug that would stop all sorts of different viral infections or decrease the severity of all sorts of different viruses. That's what they were struggling with. But I think we're moving forward in both the agency and, our company. We're getting smarter on how to do this.
Were they having difficulty with precisely the point in Near's TAME trial that you're looking at different kinds of infections or looking at different endpoints? I'm struggling to wrap my mind around what's the difference if they're prepared to be open-minded, if you just show them the data Near, with the multiple endpoints in the composite basket for the TAME trial. Why did they have difficulty if you're saying we stop infections of different kinds? It's not just looking at infection by infection.
So they did want to go virus by virus. It's not going to help you to decrease flu if you increase RSV severity. So, it was similar to TAME. You want to make sure each virus isn't getting worse, while some are getting better. That wasn't really the problem because we don't make any viral infections worse. The problem was how you diagnose whether someone has a viral respiratory tract infection or not. And at the time, they just decided nasopharyngeal swabs weren't allowed because they weren't happening in the real world. And that just makes it really hard to diagnose an infection. That was the issue. Not that they don't care about decreasing incidence.
Well, we are just about out of our scheduled time. So what I'd like to do before we sign off is go around like I did in the very beginning and ask each of the participants for a concluding thought in a sentence or two. And we'll go the same sequence we went before. That puts Michael first.
Thank you. We need a regulatory pathway for legitimate nutritional supplements that have effects on health and disease.
Well said. Near?
I think that maybe we kind of provoked this thinking that we have to cluster age-related disease together and just show the FDA that we're getting better pathways, better drugs, better health span to the population.
Joe?
I think we need access to a better database of what people are actually doing and what their health outcomes are. And, whether that's the All of Us trial. I think someone commented that there's a limited recording of supplement usage in that trial in the chat. But I think still it's pretty limited. And I think this needs to be a major goal, and it needs to have some government involvement so that people trust this database and are willing to really centralize it and record their real health information. Because I think we're just not doing enough right now to survey what people are already doing and what the result is.
Stephen?
Yeah, I was going to say something similar to Joe, but I just develop it a bit. I think that from a big pharma point of view, we are now establishing or going down the route of digitalization, establishing large databases. And I think as we're able to do that, what it's going to open up is the ability to do trials differently. And you asked me this right at the beginning. I think there's going to be not necessarily an abandonment of RCTs, but I think we're going to collect data in many different ways, whether it's real data, whether it's data we generate digitally, electronically, in silico, whatever. I think then the challenge is how can we use that so that we can persuade the regulators that these data are robust and worth, if we're looking for an indication, approving. But I actually think there is now an opportunity with databases, the way we're able to put these together across multiple cohorts. I think there's now an opportunity to look for data gaps and collect to fill those gaps in a different way.
Catherine, and you have to unmute yourself, Catherine.
Yep. Yeah. So I was going to say, I think building on the concept of big, it's not just big pharma, it's big food, it's big technology. And I think the idea is how do we all work together across sector, across industry in a way that is both about understanding the disease of aging, but also understanding the health of aging, right? And once again, that's a paradigm of, we often describe health as the antithesis of disease. And I get that, but then are there ways that we can also begin to define a unique cluster of biomarkers, endpoints that truly reflect health, to even allow for health optimization, not solely disease prevention?
Joan?
Well, I have to admit, as I'm sitting next to Zan, I am so impressed with his regulatory wisdom. And I think bringing more people with regulatory wisdom into our field is going to be really beneficial. There is a lot of wisdom in people who have worked at FDA, and it helps us sort of determine paths forward, as well as to, advocate for modifying paths forward.
Zan?
Oh dear. Well, Joan, thank you for that. No wisdom, really, just a lot of lashes on or scars on my back from many years of being in the vineyards. I would just say this has been an amazing panel. I think you all, or the audience, gets a sense of the wide spectrum of products that we're talking about. And they all have in common the potential to make a difference in preventing disease, or, to Catherine's great point, to increasing health. I think that's a great distinction, and all for it. Keep going with that, Catherine.
So I guess I've learned that there's so many opportunities here, and we need to find pathways to get them all out to the public. And you can't just increase healthy longevity by moving to a blue zone. We have to have these other things to help the population at large. And maybe we ought to be going to those blue zones, though, to study those people a little bit more and really learn, what they might be doing that we don't know about, that could give us insights as to how to develop these things. So with that, I want to thank everyone for being on the panel. And I'm going to turn it back to our hosts, Zan, Thomas, and Joan, for the closing remarks, and thank the panel for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Jay. We can't thank you and our panelists enough for this time, and not just showing up today, but in preparation previously. And this goes for all of the panels that we've had. It's a wonderful contribution. Nobody's getting paid to do this. And your time is precious, and your sleep is being impinged upon, particularly in the case of Stephen Goff in Copenhagen. So Stephen, thank you in particular for staying up late and for your invaluable contributions.